you for joining me on my YouTube channel. My name is Christiana Sage. On this channel, I will be teaching about international law, and these teachings will be in the form of short weekly lecture series. Over time, I will be surfacing varied concepts of international law. When and where applicable, these concepts will be analyzed and brought to you as it relates to current trends in international law as they arise. At the end of this lecture, you will find the transcript of the lecture in the link below. Also, for current trend and analysis in international law, you can subscribe to my blog. All the details you will find in the comment section below. For the 9th lecture in this lecture series, we will be exploring the concept of non-intervention, which is a follow-up to our last lecture on territorial sovereignty. As you will see in this lecture, the principle of non-intervention is closely linked to the principle of territorial sovereignty, in that the prohibition of non-intervention is one of the entitlements of a sovereign nation. In this lecture, we will examine 4 questions broadly. What is non-intervention? What is the difference, if any, between non-interference and non-intervention? In what forms can cohesion present? What are the prescriptive and prohibitive elements of the principle of non-intervention? To the question, what is non-intervention? Non-intervention is a cornerstone principle of international law, gaining its roots in customary international law. It is a principle of international law that prohibits states from interfering in another sovereign state's domestic affairs and political independence. This principle is a fundamental duty of states under international law that carries prescriptive and prohibitive consequences. The exact scope of what constitutes non-intervention is still subject to some level of controversy. But the ICJ defined in paragraph 205 of the case concerning military and paramilitary activities in and against Nicaragua, that is Nicaragua versus the United States of America, where it held that, in view of the generally accepted formulations, the principle forbids all states or groups of states to intervene directly or indirectly in internal or external affairs of other states. A prohibited intervention must accordingly be one bearing on matters in which each state is permitted by the principle of state sovereignty to decide freely. One of these is the choice of a political, economic, social, and cultural system, and the formulation of foreign policy. Intervention is wrongful when it uses methods of coercion in regard to such choices, which must remain free ones. The element of coercion, emphasis mine, which defines and indeed forms the very essence of prohibited intervention, is particularly obvious in the case of an intervention which uses force, either in the direct form of military action or in the indirect form of support for subversive, terrorist armed activities within another state. From this definition, we see that in its elementary form, the factors to examine in exploring the concepts of non-intervention are the existence or restraint from the interference of a sovereign state's domestic jurisdiction, and existence or restraint from any form of coercion or use of force. So what is the difference, if any, between non-interference and non-intervention? Quite often, the terms non-intervention and non-interference are used interchangeably. It is instructive to assess what the similarities and differences are, if any. In terms of differences, it has been stated that non-intervention is related to the question of territorial sovereignty, which is a preserve of international law, while non-interference relates to matters that border on the discretionary power of states and that are not regulated by international law. The implication will be that non-intervention is the legal guarantee of the state's territory, its integrity, inviolability, and subjection of the state's exclusive jurisdiction. In contrast, non-interference is inferred from political independence, both internal and external. Another distinction that has been put forth is that non-interference may involve lower intensity activity than non-intervention. However, the representation, non-intervention or non-interference. One thing is clear. These two are constitutive elements and correlative to the essential attributes of sovereignty, which in turn is logically inferred from statehood as a necessary legal implication. What forms can cohesion present? As was mentioned by the ICJ in the case concerning the military and paramilitary activities in and against Nicaragua, to determine that there has been a prohibited intervention on a sovereign state's territorial integrity, the element of cohesion has to be clearly established. What constitutes cohesion, however, is a continuing dilemma within the international community. So the crucial question will then be, how do we determine when interference in another state's internal affairs rise to a cohesive level and therefore a violation of international law? To this question, there is no straightforward answer, as there are still very many gray areas, and these continues to broaden, mainly due to the expansion of interstate relations and measures that now surface in the use of subtle and effective interference of other sovereign nations without the use of military force. So for this lecture, we will look at cohesion under three heads: military, subversive, and economic. Except for military cohesion, which may be very evident, subversive and economic cohesion may not be so apparent. Speaking about military cohesion, these corresponds with the prohibition on the use of force encapsulated in Article 2.4 of the UN Statute. These can typically take the form of military occupation of a sovereign territory, embargo, naval blockade, naval demonstration, arrest and detention of foreigners, seizure of assets belonging to another state or its nationals, or expulsion of foreign diplomats. Subversive cohesion fosters an intervention that is brought about by propaganda by one sovereign state aimed at influencing and interfering in the sovereignty of another sovereign state, with the intent of fomenting a revolt or causing civil unrest. It could also present as providing assistance to illegal and violent activities within the territory of another sovereign state. With reference to economic cohesion, this occurs when a state puts illegal pressure upon another state, such that it interferes with the territorial integrity and political independence of the other sovereign state. As with subversive cohesion, it is often challenging to determine when economic cohesion has occurred. Generally speaking, the line between economic pressure and economic cohesion is blurred. And so overall, while the state's motivation and action can act as a signifier in determining if the action carried out by the other sovereign states would amount to economic cohesion, it is important to note that there can be other determining factors based on the peculiar situation in question. What are the prescriptive and prohibitive elements of the principle of non-intervention? So the principle of non-intervention, as we earlier mentioned, carries with it some prescriptive and prohibitive elements. For example, General Assembly Resolution 2131XX of 21st December 1965, which is a declaration on the inadmissibility of intervention in the domestic affairs of states and the protection of their independence and sovereignty. And General Assembly Resolution 36103, which is a declaration on the inadmissibility of intervention and interference in the internal affairs of states, have both addressed the prohibition of non-intervention. Of the two resolutions, the most recent, which is Resolution 36103, consists of prescriptive and prohibitive elements corresponding to sovereign states' rights and duties in the prohibition of non-intervention. The rights of sovereign states regarding the prohibition of non-intervention include sovereignty, political independence, territorial integrity, national unity and security of state, national identity, and cultural heritage of its people. Also, a state has as its right the sovereign right to freely determine its own political, economic, cultural, and social systems, and to exercise sovereignty over its natural resources without intervention, interference, subversion, coercion of any shade. Also, a sovereign state has a right to free access to information to develop. In terms of the duties that sovereign states have, the corresponding duties they have with respect to the prohibition of non-intervention, sovereign states have a duty to refrain from threat or use of force, ensure that its territory is not used in a way as to violate the sovereignty or social stability of another foreign state, to refrain from armed intervention and military occupation, to refrain from forcible action that impedes a right to self-determination, to refrain from acts that destabilize the stability of another state, to refrain from promoting, encouraging, or giving direct or indirect aid to rebellious secessionist movements, to refrain from the use of its territory in training, financing, and recruitment of mercenaries, including the equipping and transiting of the mercenaries, to refrain from entering into agreements with the state to intervene or interference in the internal affairs of a third state, to abstain from defamatory campaign or hostile propaganda, to refrain from the use of external economic assistance program or adopt multilateral or unilateral reprisal or blockade as tools for pressure or cohesion against another state, for pressure or cohesion against another state, to refrain from exploitation of human rights issues, to refrain from using terrorist practices as state policy or tolerating using terrorist groups against third states, to refrain from organizing, training, financing, and arming political and ethnic groups on their territories for the purpose of subversion, disorder, or unrest in another country, and to refrain from economic, political, or military activities in the territory of another state without its consent. Just to recap, in this lecture, we have explored the concept of non-intervention and the various ways it presents. We've looked at the words non-interference and non-intervention as used interchangeably. And we have examined two United Nations General Assembly declarations and the prescribed rights and duties of sovereign states with respect to the prohibition of non-intervention. So I want to thank you so very much for joining in. And remember to like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification button so that you're notified when there is a new video. Thank you.